Welcome to your next lecture. What we're going to look at today is the skin. So before we get into this, just a couple of outcomes that we're going to cover. So by the end of this session, you should be able to understand the structure and the function of the skin and be able to describe both of those. So we're going to start off by looking at the actual structure itself. The skin is actually formed of two main kind of layers. You've got what we call the epidermis and you've got what we call the dermis. So, fun little fact, the skin is actually the largest organ in the whole of the human body. And it might be worth just making a little note of that because a couple of these things may tend to pop up in exams. The skin, however, is also the first line of defense against any kind of injury or infection. So, thinking in terms now of you get something on your skin, the skin will actually produce an acidic layer, which we'll discuss a little bit later on in a bit more detail, to try and kill off any bacteria that may seep through the skin and enter the bloodstream, which is why it's actually the first line of defense against any kind of infection. So, let's look at this kind of the surface layer, we'll call it, which is the epidermis. And this is formed of 5 layers. So the surface layer, so the very top part, is called the horny, goes down into the clear, the granular, prickle cell, and the basal. So this is just the 5 layers of the epidermis. So we haven't actually reached the dermis yet. It's just, like I say, it's just the epidermis. But one important thing to note is that the basal is the deepest of the epidermis. Because again, it's something that's popped up in exams in the past of knowing which is the deepest of these 5 layers. It might even ask you what is the most superficial, what is the surface layer, so you would need to know that that's horny. So when you look at these 5 layers, make sure to make a note of the order of those and include those in your revision. So it kind of says there that the skin cells in 5 separate layers forms the outer layer of the skin and it protects the dermis below. So again, that's important to know because the dermis is actually really important, and we'll explain that in a couple of slides as to why the dermis is more important out of the two. So the epidermis is that, again, first line of defense. It's the layer that we can afford to kind of damage a little bit because it's there for protection, and we don't want it to go any kind of deeper where it's going to reach the dermis. So melanocytes, what are they? Well, to start with, they're found in the basal layer of the epidermis. So they're found in that kind of deepest of those 5 layers. Their actual function, however, is to control the pigmentation of the skin. And it does this by increasing concentrations of melanin in response to UV light. So it's the reason why when we expose ourselves to sunlight, that our skin will tan. But it's also what will cause the skin to kind of give you signs of burning. So when your skin goes red, that's because those pigmentations, the color of that skin has changed, and it's a warning as to, you need to get out of the sunlight because this is actually starting to cause damage. So it changes that color of the skin to kind of warn you when you've had too much sun exposure. So I mentioned we were going to go onto the dermis and look at why this was more important. Well, one thing to start off with is by explaining that it's actually much thicker than the epidermis. And there's a particular reason for this. So it's formed primarily of connective tissue, which is your elastin and your collagen fibers. But it also contains a lot more important structures. So your hair follicles rely on the dermis being strong enough to support them. You have your erector pili muscles in that particular region. It contains your sweat glands. It contains sebaceous glands. So a sebaceous gland releases oil onto the skin, which we kind of mentioned earlier is acidic. So it's what kind of kills off bacteria on the surface. It contains fat cells. It contains all of your nerves and your sensory receptors, but also your blood and your lymphatic vessels. So we don't want to damage this part of the skin because there's a lot of structures that rely on it being strong and rigid to support them. If you damage that area, then there's a chance that you're going to damage those sweat glands, sebaceous glands, your nerves there. So we have that kind of surface, I suppose, epidermis, that kind of surface layer of skin as your initial form of protection. So looking at the functions of the skin, we've mentioned a couple throughout this so far, but we're going to go into a bit more detail. So the skin isn't just there for protection. It's got a whole host of things. So one thing I want you to remember is an acronym called PRESS-D, and this will go over the 6 kind of functions of the skin. So the P on press being for protection. You've also got regulation of temperature. You've got excretion, sensation, secretion, and formation of vitamin D. We're going to go through each of these individually now. So we're going to start with protection. So we've mentioned that it protects us from infection due to the presence of keratin and from an injury via reflex responses. But you've also got regulation of temperature. And the way it does this is by releasing sweat. So I'll give you an example. You're going out for a run. You're going to get to a point, your body's going to start sweating. The reason for that is it releases sweat as a liquid to cool down the skin to prevent us from overheating. Excretion, so as I just mentioned, it excretes the sweat, which is 99% water and 1% mineral salts. So again, it's why it's also important that we're consuming enough water, because when we lose it through exercise, it needs to be replenished. And again, if you are exercising, then you're going to notice that your body's going to need that water. And, because your body's using it to cool your body down, you need to replenish that. Then you've got sensation. So sensation is our nerve endings. So again, imagine in your hands now, you touch something that's hot. Your body will sense that and it will send a signal to tell you to move your hand away. It's what allows you to sense the cold temperature, textures. So it's important to know that that is also a function of the skin, is to have those sensory receptors to pick up that information for you. Then you've got secretion of oily and mildly acidic sebum, which is released from those sebaceous glands. So we've mentioned that that's obviously to kill any kind of bacteria, anything on the surface of the skin to prevent infection later on. But then also the synthesis of vitamin D, melanin, and other chemicals, which again, we need that exposure to sunlight in order to get that vitamin D in the body. So, skin conditions. Skin condition and the effects of the aging process are going to depend on many different factors. And that can be from things like your genetics, level of UV exposure, your dietary nutrient requirements, even hydration levels. Also down to exposure to damaging substances such as nicotine and alcohol and the effects that can have on the skin. General health as well. So what is going to be the effects of poor skin conditions? So if we think of poor skin conditions now, they're going to naturally have things maybe like fewer elastin and collagen fibers in the connective tissue. They may have slower rates of hair and nail growth. Poor skin conditions can lead to less sebum, which is then going to result in poor protection and dryness of the skin. Impaired sweat response, which is then going to start messing with your temperature regulation. You may have reduced cell production, which can lead to thinner skin later on in life, reduced tolerance to heat and cold, and even down to a reduced resistance to infection. Because again, if we're not producing enough sebum, then there's not as much kind of sebum being produced to kill off that like infection or any kind of pathogens that may your skin may come into contact with. So it's going to put you at a higher risk. And finally now, what kind of things can the skin present to you just from looking at it? So you can potentially look at the skin and have underlying skin issues that can lead to, say, a tissue dysfunction. So one thing, when you're massaging, if you notice an area is tensed or it has reduced elasticity, that's going to make the skin feel tight. Therefore, you're not going to be able to slide over it as easily. And that can be maybe down to kind of underlying muscle fascia issues, indications of adhesions, so knots or scar tissue that's built up. Tenderness can develop when circulation is reduced or if there is current inflammation or irritation. So again, keep an eye out for things like this. When you're kind of doing your massage with a client, you're palpating the area. If you notice inflammation or irritation is there, that could be an underlying sign to keep an eye on. Temperature differences resulting from increased or reduced circulation or metabolic activity. this can indicate over or underactivity of underlying tissues, so ischemia or muscle spasm. So again, be mindful when you're massaging. If you feel an area that feels a little bit warmer or a little bit colder, just keep an eye on those signs. And then finally, intermittent dragging or juddering can indicate trigger points in the underlying myofascial tissue. So if the skin starts to judder as you're going over it, it could be an indication that there's scar tissue or knots that have built up in that particular area. So hopefully by this point, you should now be able to describe the structure of the skin, looking at that epidermis and the dermis and the layers that are involved, and also some of the functions of the skin.